you agree that we should begin clearing the room from the outside before making entry, then you'll likely also agree that when clearing rooms, you shouldn't ride the door into the room, because that's very similar to dumping into the room before checking center, except it's a little bit worse, and I'll explain why. If you'd like to continue supporting the channel, make sure you're feeding the algorithm down below so everyone else can see the options and they can decide for themselves. If you stick around until the end of the video, I'll talk about what isn't so obvious in that intro video and do my best to address any validations you may have for that technique and give you some other options. Look, I know right about now the blood is boiling for everyone who enjoys running around an empty training house like their hair is on fire. Before we get into the practical portion, I feel like it's necessary that we go over some fundamental understanding so we can lay the foundation for which we are operating. First, we should be making decisions off of the standard existing, which is a bad guy with a gun waiting to kill you. Otherwise, enter however you want. Secondly, what we should be doing while executing tactics is systematically mitigating risk by eliminating threat areas as we encounter them. Now, if you're the bad guy, there's two things you probably don't want: the good guy or the opposition in the room with you and capable of hurting you, because self-preservation, and ultimately, he doesn't achieve his objective of doing the killing if he's dead himself. Therefore, if we know the bad guy is trying to avoid that, at what point do you think he starts shooting? He probably starts shooting at the threshold, as demonstrated over and over again in law enforcement encounters and every urban military conflict that's ever existed. There's several recent videos of the Israeli IDF in actual combat that demonstrates that's exactly what happens, some of which I've reposted on my Instagram. If all the evidence points to the fact that the threshold is the most vital danger area when the standard exists, what does that mean exactly? It probably means that the bad guy starts shooting as they see the door coming open, which makes riding the door into the room a significant problem for you, seeing much less of the room sooner and/or taking rounds through the door from an unknown area. Another reason you can find yourself in a really bad situation is if you commit to that technique and the door is barricaded or partially barricaded. Now let's say, for example, that's your tactic, that's your SOP, that's what you do at the threshold, is ride the door into the room. What happens when the door is barricaded? Well, the first thing is we probably get caught off guard because we train in environments where the door is always open for us. And so when we get to the door and we expect to be following the door in, but it doesn't allow us to do that, that's gonna catch us off guard. So now we have to react to that. Once we feel that the door is barricaded, possibly the bad guy is shooting through the door already, but now we have to stand here and try to force the door open, right? Which is also spending way too much time here doing nothing and just making yourself vulnerable. Now, what happens if the door is partially barricaded or just not barricaded well enough to where we could actually get the door open at least somewhat? Well, we come to the door and then the door starts coming open. We start forcing the door open, and then at what point do we go in? Do we go in when the door is cracked like this, where only I can fit through the door? What happens if he, again, is shooting through the door and now I get shot and now I'm halfway in the room, halfway outside, and the number 2 guy can't get in here to help me at all? Now you might say, well, the way that you work doors also sucks. And I agree with you, in that situation, it sucks, but it actually sucks less in my opinion. So if I set up on this door and I go to work the door, well, one, if the door is locked, right, or it's not moving at all, it's either barricaded or it's locked, right? And so what's the proper recourse for that? Well, kick the door open, right? And so we could, try to kick it in the way in which I've described in the past to get the door open. If you have somebody else here with you, you could donkey kick it so you don't, overextend your knee. But what if the door comes open and there's resistance and it's barricaded? Okay, well, at this point here, we're still trying to mitigate being shot through the door, right? And now we also, for whatever reason, mission dependent, we still need to get the door open. So instead of standing here, trying to force the door open and force your way through here, we could do that from here. And then we could start working it that way. Of course, the door isn't always gonna come open as easy as that, right? But if the door doesn't come open, you could expect it not to come open that easy, but we pop the door open, we feel that it's barricaded, we can continue to work the door, work that barricaded door as much as possible, out of the fatal funnel, out of what we could expect to be the most vulnerable spot at the threshold. Now, the argument for that technique will be that it's for hostage rescue, and during a hostage rescue, we have to get in there fast to create angles, and not doing this tactic sacrifices that speed. I don't disagree that that's the goal or the perceived goal, but you're probably also your slowest when you're laying on the ground. And so maybe willfully sacrificing yourself to stack bodies at the door based on what you believe or perceive is happening isn't the greatest idea. Maybe it makes tactical sense to determine at the threshold if creating angles needs to actually happen, because skipping this process when it turns out that's not the case means slower time to the target and an overall greater likelihood of a catastrophic situation. And you might also say, well, that technique is for when you have the element of surprise before the bad guy has time to ready himself for an engagement. And I don't disagree with that idea. But I would challenge you to ask yourself, at what point is the element of surprise lost? In the intro video, that was the second floor. There were multiple engagements before getting to that room, and they even engaged the guy at the top of the stairs right before they made it to that door. Now that I'm sure I've satisfied probably everybody on the internet, let's talk about some options. Now, using that video in that particular scenario as an example, what are some options that are available to you? Well, if you noticed in that video, they were at the end of the hallway. There were no opposing threats to the door that they were trying to enter. And so as the number one man approaching this door, instead of keeping everybody on this side and working the door, through the door, riding the door in for the sake of speed, I guess, the number one guy can cross over the door. Now he can work the door from a more advantageous position. As the door comes open, the number two guy, who actually would probably end up being the number one guy, is seeing into the hard corner, the most extreme corner first, and he's gonna start working that pretty quickly because I'm still waiting for the door to come open so I can check off on my corner. And so as the door comes open, this guy over here, so we'll simulate the doors coming open, and I'll engage that target. That is where that bad guy was in that video. So the door comes open, I'm stepping center. And so that's what it would look like stepping center if we were trying to go for speed and trying to get in there, trying to create angles. So we've taken up the majority of the room, maybe the 10% over there, maybe 10% in that corner, which again, we're seeing all that, most of it, taking care of that if it needs to be taken care of. And then we are entering into that, check that 10% or whatever it is that we haven't seen yet, collapsing the room back down. Now, if we're gonna work that in a more methodical approach, or maybe we weren't so much concerned about speed in terms of hostage rescue and getting in there to create angles, we would be doing the same thing. We would just be doing more of the work from outside first. So as the door comes open, instead of stepping center right away and having to deal with all this, I would just continue to work this around in a manner like this, and then I may even get here and come back, and then maybe somebody else is going first or making a different decision. Maybe I see that this was a corner-fed room, and I don't want to enter and have to either button hook or turn my body this direction. And so if I see that that's a wall there, I would just go muzzle down. That would indicate to him that he needs to enter the room, and then we would enter the room that way. Now, I also have seen this technique being done when the door is going the other direction. So instead of following the door in this way, I have seen people following the door in this way, okay? And of the techniques that I went over today that I think are not the best options, that has to be my least favorite. Of course, again, because we're worried about somebody shooting at the door at the threshold as we're coming through, and using a physical barrier for concealment purposes, not really concealment purposes, but it is concealing you, makes it very difficult for you to orient yourself towards what's happening, be able to see the threat as soon as practical, and ensure there isn't somebody there waiting for you, because basically you're going to be holding the door or riding the door in as potentially rounds are coming through the door at you from that hard corner, and I would just prefer to be out here instead. I asked around and I heard several different things on where that technique came from, and I heard that they were using it and now they're not using it because guys were getting hurt doing that. If you know any of the origins around that technique, who's doing it, why it's being done, whether you agree or disagree with it, leave that in the comment section. When somebody actually has a gun and is waiting to hurt you, I believe engagements are won or lost at the threshold. If you believe that's also true, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel.